Welcome back to Fast Market, everyone. I'm Kevin Hinks, joined by my co-host for today, Joe Mazzola. Now let's bring in the Vice President of Research for LikeFolio.com, Miss Megan Brantley, to the show. She's going to talk. Megan, I gave you a tough lift on a Friday. I threw some energy and all things energy, and you brought us a bunch of data on really a full encompassing look at all things energy. Tell us what you came up with, Megan.
Yeah, so we really wanted to take a wide scope whenever we switched this topic for today. And I think what these trends that we're about to look at really illustrate is just what is top of mind for the consumer right now. So, we're heading into holiday shopping. We hear a lot of mentions of people who are talking about just this macroeconomic pressure. And this is a really good time to just kind of do that gut check and that pulse check on the consumer. And whenever we look at these trends, you can see that gas prices are still a top concern among consumers. We have, mentions of inflation fear high, mentions of food price concerns high, and these gas price concerns are still high, up by about 91% year over year. Now, I will say, whenever we look at just overall mentions, the trajectory of these gas price concerns, even though that 91% seems really high, that's actually down a bit from the highs that we recorded earlier this summer, and that's kind of followed the actual price of gas. So as the price of gas does go down, we do see some tempering there, but you can see that it's leveling off much higher. And so it's an interesting phenomenon because we see a lot of consumers who are saying, yes, they're excited that the price of gas is going down, but there's a lot of uncertainty just about how long this will last. And this has kind of transitioned into other consumer behaviors. So it's interesting to see, as this surge in gas price and just this concept of, gas is expensive is top of consumer minds. We've also seen a surge in electric vehicle prices. And so, now we have this strong demand for EVs, and alongside you have a lot of these companies that are putting out EVs that are falling within the realm of consumer budgets. They're much more affordable now. They seem much more just like cars. And so it's interesting to see that effect. And this chart, this deal discovery chart, I think this is just really indicative whenever we look at what consumers are mindful of, especially this holiday shopping season. We do see the pressures of high gas prices and inflation weighing on some of those purchasing decisions, and we see that deal hunting is a lot more significant this year.
I guess my question would be, where's that intersection between we want to find vehicles that do better with these gas prices, specifically the EVs, and the interest rates? I mean, at some point, yeah. and then add to that the wealth effect of what's happening to the consumer in terms of the market as well too. It seems like at some point we should have to expect the auto dealers to maybe start lowering prices a little bit, but we haven't seen that yet, have we?
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. I think that one thing that's interesting, though, whenever we look at just the entire EV market specifically, if we're going to take this approach, one thing that we do see looking forward, especially in names like Ford and GM, who are more of these traditional or these classic automakers that are expanding their offerings. So they have more hybrid vehicles, they have more electric vehicles, and we're seeing consumers really positively, taking these into consideration. And whenever we look at Tesla just as a whole, we start to see a little bit of tempering of demand. So, Tesla has just been this monster player in the EV sector, and now that sector is getting very crowded, and not just with other, trendy EV names, but with just these classic names. And so it's interesting to kind of see that shift take place, but just overall across the board, I think, the concept of gas prices, this is just something that consumers are more aware of now. And even as prices are going down, those concerns aren't necessarily going away. So I think it's smart that we do see these classic, car manufacturers like a GM, like a Ford, entering this market.
Megan, I think it's interesting for me to connect the dots to your data to where we are in the market, right? I look at your one chart where it's got inflation fear is the top concern, food price is the second, and gas is the third. Food and energy, right? Right after the kind of the all-encompassing inflation look. But that's important because with what could happen this weekend if something disrupts crude oil in any one of these many forces that are coming in the next week or so, Megan, you can see it could have a high effect on how people spend and what they look at and how they spend other places. This is why we wanted to focus on energy in this show, and because the next 5 to 7 to 10 days in energy is going to be pretty important. A lot of people calling, Megan, for $100 crude oil, not $80 crude oil.
Yeah, I think that you make a really good point. And I think it's also interesting just to show kind of the state of the consumer right now where, people ask us, is the consumer still spending? Is the consumer still strong? And we definitely do see signs that the consumer is spending. We look at this early holiday shopping data. The consumer is very strong, but a lot of that is because of financing. We see indications of consumers who are utilizing buy now, pay later mechanisms up significantly year over year. We see mentions of people who are maxing out credit cards. We see, lower savings rates. So we see a consumer that is spending, but this is also a stressed consumer. So, there's been a little bit of a temporary relief when it comes to gas prices, but if that changes, that could really amp up the volume and start to impact those purchasing behaviors elsewhere, like you pointed out.
Megan, one more quick question. How do we take this data? Now, we're about to trade Tesla based on this, and Tesla's got other news coming out, and you can pick, this is the day where we have more topics to talk about. Tesla, by definition, and Elon Musk, by definition, has a whole tree of topics that we can get to. But how does your data, right, with energy and all the concerns about energy, how does that move over? How do you connect the dots to electric cars and Tesla in general?
Well, I think that one thing that's really interesting is, again, we see those concerns about gas prices significantly higher, even though they've come down very far. And we see consumer demand for electric vehicles remaining very high and continuing to grow. So I think that long term, this is something that we think is here to stay in terms of electric vehicles. When we look at the full macro picture of all of the different EVs and just vehicles in our landscape, right now Tesla is the dominator. When it comes to overall consumer mind share, Tesla is still the clear leader. Whenever we look at which brands underneath Tesla is growing in terms of demand, in terms of year-over-year growth, we see significant strengths in the higher-end models of Tesla. So that's interesting. Perhaps consumers are starting to trade up. We do see some tempering, though, in that typical just Model 3 growth demand. And I think a lot of that has to do with these new entrants that are entering the market that have some comparable options that consumers are considering. So, big picture, we do see a little bit of a tempering in that growth rate for Tesla, but long-term, the macro tailwinds are there. And so far, Tesla is executing better than its peers.
Megan Brantley, Vice President of Research for LikeFolio.com. Thank you so much for coming on, bringing the big data as LikeFolio.com always does. Have a great Friday, Megan.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me. Y'all have a good Friday as well.
Joe, when you look at Tesla and everything